Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight's program, Challenges of Diversity in the U.S. Military, is presented by the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Before we begin, I would like to thank our donors and our members for their support. The Pritzker Military Museum and Library is a nonpartisan, non-government information center supported by its members and sponsors. Our mission is to increase the public's understanding of military history and national security affairs, as well as how military service and the sacrifices made by the men and women who have worn the uniform have shaped our country's democracy. I'm Dr. Matthew S. Muehlbauer, Chief Military Historian of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists. Scarlett Kim is a staff attorney at the ACLU National Security Project. Prior to joining the ACLU, Ms. Kim worked as a legal officer at Privacy International, an associate legal advisor at the International Criminal Court, and as a Gruber Fellow in Global Justice at the New York Civil Liberties Union. She also served as a law clerk for the Honorable John Gleeson of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of New York. She is a graduate of Yale College and Yale Law School. Robert F. Jefferson, Jr. is an associate professor of history at the University of New Mexico. He is the author of Fighting for Hope, African Americans and the 93rd Infantry Division in World War II and Post-War America, which was nominated for the William Colby Book Prize, and is currently working on his next book entitled Color and Disability, Vasco Hale in 20th Century America. Dr. Jefferson is also the author of Brothers in Valor, Battlefield Stories, the 89 African Americans awarded the Medal of Honor, and is the editor of Black Veterans, Politics, and Civil Rights in 20th Century America, Closing Ranks. He's written extensively on the relationship between African American GIs and their communities during the Second World War, on the Black Panther Party, and the lived experiences of Black disabled veterans in the 20th century. He served as a Fulbright Distinguished Chair of American Studies at the University of Southern Denmark in 2019, and is currently a participating speaker in the Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lectureship Program. Heather Marie Stur is Professor of History at the University of Southern Mississippi and Senior Fellow at the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society. She's the author of Saigon at War, South Vietnam and the Global 60s, the U.S. Military and Civil Rights since World War II, and Beyond Combat, Women and Gender in the Vietnam War Era. She is also co-editor of Integrating the U.S. Military, Race, Gender, and Sexuality since World War II. Dr. Stur's articles have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC, the National Interest, and other journals and newspapers. In 2013 and 14, Dr. Stur was a Fulbright Scholar in Vietnam, where she was a visiting professor on the Faculty of International Relations at the University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Ho Chi Minh City. She is currently writing a book about the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And apologies to everyone due to technical difficulties. Dr. Stur will be joining us via audio, but the video will not be available. But she is with us here now. But first, I have a variety of questions I'd like to ask our panelists based upon their research. And once again, thank you everyone for joining us here today. I would like to start with Dr. Jefferson. And Dr. Jefferson, to begin, given your work on the social and cultural history of the U.S. military, and especially your study of the military experiences of Black service members, what do you perceive as the driving forces in the American military's historical attempts to realize diversity?
Thank you for having me. Much of my work basically has examined the African-American experience in 20th century wars and how they shape the parameters of military policy during basically from the beginning of the 20th century well through the Vietnam War era. And the more I think about this, and I had a chance to really get into thinking about it in depth, I think much of the driving forces that in the American Army Armed Forces historical attempts to try to realize diversity has resembled a multivalent prism, one lens that is reflective, very much reflective of the racialist and also gendered mores, traditions, and practices in the American society that is defended and continues to defend. And then the other lens is one that in which they're constantly reminded, military officials, policymakers are constantly reminded of its place in America's journey towards realizing the central tenets of real democracy. And I think you see this it is very much in play from the beginning of the 20th century when you start looking at the African American experience in the Spanish American Cuban Philippine War, down through the First World War, in which the American military is trying to figure out how to situate the African American service personnel in this wars to end all wars, but at the same time, it is a military that's deeply moored in many of the traditions and practices of that period and doesn't allow them to fully utilize the personnel. And not only that, but they're also being buffeted by the ideas that are being thrown at them, and it's being bandied about within the halls of Washington about, okay, so what does this mean in terms of questions of democracy and thinking about full equality and so forth? You see this also playing itself out in the Second World War in a large fashion, because in the interwar period, you see the military policymakers struggling to square many of the ideas they have about the capabilities of Blacks in combat with the democratic principles that that the country is espousing. And also realizing that in future wars that there's a large segment of the population that's going to be called upon in order to defend it. So I think it's through that multivalent prism that we see the first laggard steps towards trying to achieve diversity in a certain sense. And we see this continuing through Korea. And then we also see it really playing itself out in Vietnam. And then later on in the all-volunteer, basically, force that we see today. But I think that equation changes a bit, but I'll talk about that later.
Dr. Stur, I'd like to pose the same question to you, but based upon your research regarding women in the military. And also, I understand you might have some comments regarding LGBTQ service members in terms of what have been the driving forces in the American military's historical attempts to realize diversity based upon your studies here.
Yes, thanks, Matt. And just like Robert, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to be on this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm honored to be able to speak alongside Robert and Scarlett. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And to the viewers, I do apologize being only audio instead of video tonight. So as far as women in the military, the primary motivator for all the branches of the service to integrate women into the service at various points in U.S. history has been the need for service personnel. So we could talk about instances where American women have served in the armed forces in unofficial capacities going back to the American Revolution. And then, serving not really in the military, but kind of alongside the military in the Civil War and in World War I. But then it's really in World War II and the intense, I should say manpower, I'd say service personnel power needs of World War II that we see the services really begin to officially mobilize women beyond the work of being nurses. So, for example, in the Army, the Women's Army Corps was established in 1943 as a way to create official positions in the Army that women could serve in to free up men to serve in combat and other kinds of fighting positions. So we're talking about clerical office type jobs, and those sorts of things. And so again, because it was the intense manpower needs of World War II, that the Army and the other branches of the service decided, look, we've got a population of people that we can mobilize to put into jobs that where it won't seem, kind of culturally inappropriate to put a woman in an Army uniform and put her behind a desk or put her on a radio or something like that. Although there definitely was resistance to women's military service of any kind in the American population, and also, among male service personnel. But it was those service personnel needs of World War II. And then the next time you see this kind of large mobilization of women into the military is, and Robert mentioned this, he said he's going to talk about it later on, but it's the creation of the all-volunteer force after the Vietnam War, where no longer could the services rely upon the draft to fill the ranks. They had to recruit people to come and join the service. And one of the ways in which they recruit, or one of the groups of people that the services looked upon to recruit, were women. And so that involved a number of different kind of advertising campaigns to make the military something that women do too. So here's an institution that you could join and get job training. It's an institution that you could join and get education benefits. It's an institution you can join and have an adventure, be sent around the world, and those sorts of things. So really in all cases, it's a need for personnel that the military has, the U.S. military has mobilized women. As far as LGBTQ personnel, that really is the same thing. And one of the things that's interesting about that is if you look at examples of what are called blue discharges. So these are less than honorable discharges, and it's the type of discharge that was given to gay and lesbian service members before the repeal of before 2011. The instances of blue discharges decrease in wartime. And that's because commanders are told to kind of look the other way because we need people in the service. So Vietnam, for example, I've written about a couple of cases of servicemen who were either they came out or they were known to be gay, and they were not discharged because at the time there was a need for personnel. And so that's really interesting. And then you see those kinds of discharges go up in peacetime because there's not the same need for personnel. So commanders are instructed to crack down more on issues of homosexuality. One of the things that I think really motivated the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a couple of things. One is that, again, the kind of the need for personnel that have particular skills. So if we need an Arabic linguist, or we need someone with a PhD in computer science, we can't really worry about what they do in their personal life because we need those skills in the army that we're in today, or the military that we're in today. And I think the other thing too at that point was activism on the home front as far as civilian, more kind of growing civilian openness to gays and lesbians in general. And so I think those two things really motivated the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. But even, again, like I said, even in the case of LGBTQ service personnel, it's that need for manpower, of service personnel that has motivated the military to integrate.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Stur. So, Ms. Kim, now, as a lawyer, your perspective is a little bit different. So I was hoping, could you discuss the legal history of immigrants in the U.S. military and its impact upon diversity in the U.S. Armed Forces?
Thank you. And like my fellow panelists, I would also like to thank the Pritzker Military Museum for organizing this panel and for inviting me to speak today. Before I get to the heart of your question, I thought it might be helpful to briefly explain my experience on this topic, as it does color a bit my approach to the answer. So I'm a lawyer with the ACLU's National Security Project, and our project's work focuses on challenging national security policies and practices that negatively impact our civil liberties and civil rights. And my work in particular focuses on issues at the intersection of national security and immigration. In 2020, we filed a lawsuit on behalf of a class of non-citizens serving in the military who were entitled to naturalize expeditiously as US citizens on the basis of their military service. And that lawsuit specifically challenged a policy enacted by the Department of Defense, which effectively obliterated that expedited path to citizenship by requiring service members to meet new requirements before they could apply for citizenship. And that same year, we won our case, and the court ordered the Department of Defense to vacate the policy and ensure service members could apply expeditiously for naturalization. I think we're probably all familiar with the adage that the US is a nation of immigrants, but I think before I worked on this case, I personally had no conception of just how important a role immigrants have historically played in the US military. And I thought I would talk about this from three different angles. First, I want to provide a little bit of data that illustrates the number of immigrants that have historically served in the military. And then I want to talk about federal legislation that has explicitly recognized the role that immigrants play by historically providing for expedited naturalization for these service members. And finally, I want to talk a bit about some of the qualitative contributions that immigrants make by serving in our military. So immigrants have served in every major conflict since the founding of this country. The numbers are frankly pretty astounding. During World War I, for example, nearly 500,000 immigrants, about a quarter of whom were non-citizens at the time of their service, fought on behalf of the United States. Over 300,000 immigrants served during World War II, over a third of whom were non-citizens at the time of their service. In the modern era, immigrants have continued to play a vital role, including since 2001, when the current period of armed conflict commenced. In 2009, there were over 100,000 immigrants serving in the US military. Between 2011 and 2015, an average of 10,000 non-citizens served in the Army per year. And in our lawsuit, the Department of Defense represented that approximately 7,000 or so non-citizens currently enlist in the Army per year. And the United States has a long and well-established tradition of rewarding non-citizens who enlist in the military with an expedited path to citizenship. Moreover, that tradition has long recognized that non-citizen enlisting, particularly during wartime, should be awarded an opportunity to apply for naturalization almost immediately upon entering service. And Congress actually first authorized the expedited naturalization of non-citizens serving in the military over 200 years ago during the War of 1812 by passing legislation permitting non-citizens to immediately become citizens so long as they had declared an intention to naturalize before the start of hostilities and served in the war. During the Civil War, the Union passed numerous laws to encourage non-citizen enlistment by offering a path of expedited naturalization, including an 1862 law providing for any non-citizen discharged honorably with citizenship upon proof of 1 year's residency, which was a significant loosening of the requirements of residency for non-service members. And during World War I, Congress provided a similar expedited path to citizenship in 1918 law, which waived any residency requirement whatsoever. And in discussing the act, senators emphasized that the nearly 125,000 non-citizens then serving in the Army should not be sent to fight in a war overseas without first obtaining their citizenship. During World War II, Congress passed similar legislation, also waiving any residency requirement for non-citizens who wish to naturalize on the basis of their service. In 1952, Congress enacted the Immigration and Nationality Act, which is the present piece of legislation that continues to authorize an expedited path to citizenship for non-citizen service members. And under a provision of the act, non-citizens serving during a period of armed conflict, which we're currently in, may apply for naturalization as soon as they begin their service. And the legislative history of the act explains that the purpose of the provision is to ensure that service members acquire citizenship before they're potentially assigned to combat zones to avoid a non-citizen perishing in action before they could become citizens. Finally, I just want to touch upon some of the positive contributions immigrants have brought to the military. This has been amply documented in studies and literature which have emanated from the military itself. The first relates to recruitment. Immigrants are critical to ensuring that the military meet its recruitment goals. For example, the Army has represented that in every recruitment year between 2002 and 2013, with the exception of 1 year, the Army would have failed its recruitment goals for its active duty force without non-citizen enlistments. The second relates to the types of qualities that immigrant recruits bring to the military. The Department of Defense reported that in 2016, the majority of immigrant recruits had Tier 1 education credentials and that they had a high school diploma and an armed forces qualification test score in the 50th percentile or higher. And it reported that a higher percentage of non-citizen recruits had these qualifications compared to citizen recruits. Non-citizen recruits also have substantially lower attrition rates than their citizen counterparts, according to several studies, even after controlling for demographic and service-related characteristics. And non-citizen recruits, and this goes to something that Heather mentioned, also often possess skills that are really critical to the military, whether it's linguistic diversity and cultural competencies, or, for example, medical and information technology expertise. And finally, I just want to mention that the contributions that immigrants have made are really reflected in the number who've served with distinction and been awarded honors in the military. And one example is that over 20% of recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor have been immigrants.
Great, thank you. That's actually quite enlightening in terms of all the contributions that immigrants have made and the legislative history. Greatly appreciated. What I'd like to do, so thank you all for that, for answering that first round of questions. I kind of like to focus the next set of questions on the experience of war, in terms of how has war impacted the various groups that we're talking about here today. Dr. Stur, we can start with you in terms of how has war shaped the experience of women in the military, and you can also mention LGBTQ service members if you wish.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found to be really interesting in terms of women that I've interviewed about their service is that they have, because they have not until recently served in combat units, they have not been considered, service personnel who experience that. But as I've talked to nurses and even some civilians who, women who serve in civilian groups, like say, for example, the American Red Cross, but in war zones, they talk about how while they aren't experiencing combat physically in terms of being kind of on the front lines or being a part of a combat unit, the emotional and mental trauma that they experience seeing what war does to humans is, it was really enlightening to me as far as thinking about how war impacts all of those who serve, whether they're people serving in desk jobs or people serving in hospitals or people serving in close combat. And so, to think about the fact that while, women haven't, again, until recently served in combat roles, they have experienced the trauma of combat because they've had to care for, as nurses, wounded service personnel. Or, I remember interviewing someone in the Women's Army Corps who talked about having to box up the personal effects of a soldier who had died and send that back to his family, and how that felt to have to do that, and to kind of have such a personal encounter with this person who is deceased because of war. And so I think women have experienced the trauma of war even before they were able to serve in combat experiences. So that's kind of been one of the takeaways that I've had looking at groups of people who aren't necessarily those who we think of when we think of as like frontline soldiers, that war really does, the trauma of war really affects them for, much of their lives, if not their entire life after the war is over.
Thank you for that. Actually, you reminded me that there's this idea that's become more prevalent or better understood in recent years, this idea of secondary PTSD. And I'm not an expert, but it seems to be something that you're talking about here, that people may not be directly involved in the violence, but interacting with people who have been, they sort of suffer some of those effects. So thank you for that. I've been hearing that from other places as well. Dr. Jefferson, I'd like to pose to you on how has the experience of war shaped the experience of Black service members?
Well, for the piece that I wrote for you for that blog, I opened by talking about W.B. Du Bois and his statement about how African Americans had to seize their citizenship through sacrifice and bloodshed. And I think by starting off with that, for my work and talking to these veterans and talking about their experiences of war, in many cases, they talked about the salutary effects of war in itself. And that is, as they started to approach the possibility of entering combat and also thinking about frontline action, they would have these conversations among themselves about, okay, so what are we fighting this war for? It became very immediate for them. They were fighting for something that was, let me put it this way. It was something that was very intangible, like democracy, but it was tangible from the standpoint that they were fighting for their family members and those who are serving beside them. So it became immediate. And then the other thing is that for their wartime experience, many of them talked about how they were meeting African Americans, particularly during the Second World War, coming from all walks of life. For instance, they would be training at an isolated military outpost, and they would see someone coming from some of the northeastern as well as midwestern, western parts of the country, and a large portion of them were coming from the Deep South. And if you think about that as being like a crucible in a way, they were all coming together and they were having to experience each other for the first time. I think there was a cementing of community there that continued on throughout not just the fighting itself, but also well beyond the fighting. I mean, they stayed in touch with each other even after the fighting ended. The other thing, and this is the last thing, is that they started to have a sort of a raised sense of expectation as to what they could expect coming home. They knew it was going to be tempered by that much of the racism that they were and the discrimination that they were fighting against was still going to be there, but they were far more determined to seize the possibilities than any other time. And then you see this happening from the First World War through basically the immediate aftermath of the fighting in places like Chicago, as well as in New York and so forth. And also in the rural South, you see this awakening occurring. And then after the Second World War, clearly you see this happening. They return home. They are very much determined to seize the possibilities of what they had witnessed and what they had endured, both at home as well as overseas. And they were not willing to let that go. I mean, I think that's a part of this story. Then the other part of it is that they achieved veteran status, and for them, that's a part of that raised expectations as well. So they're translating this and communicating this with not only among themselves, but also within their neighborhoods and their communities and their family members. And their family members, I think, are the inheritors of much of those raised expectations. So it's a lot of stuff that's happening in the wake of war, particularly 20th century wars. And I think we're only now starting to really understand what that's all about.
Great, thank you. In fact, you just remind me that there's, at least I've come across some of the literature that very explicitly ties the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s to the experiences of Black veterans and coming back to the communities with those raised expectations, as I understand. Great, thank you. And Scarlett Kim, I'd like to ask you, how has the experience of war shaped the immigrant experience in the U.S. military?
So earlier, I detailed our long history of legislation rewarding non-citizens who enlist in the military with an expedited path to citizenship. So whether enlistment happens, however, during peacetime or wartime has a real impact on the naturalization process. So for example, the Immigration and Nationality Act does provide for a more streamlined naturalization process for non-citizens enlisting during peacetime, but that process is exceptionally streamlined during wartime. So periods of armed conflict provide immigrants with a particularly expedited path to citizenship, and we know that many immigrants have taken advantage of this pathway. So for example, during our current period of armed conflict, which began in 2001, over 100,000 non-citizens have naturalized on the basis of their military service. It's also during periods of war that our country has created pathways to citizenship for immigrants who might not have been able to avail themselves of citizenship otherwise. And I'll provide a few examples here. During World War II, I already mentioned that Congress eliminated some of the typical requirements necessary for naturalization, including a period of residence. In a subsequent law in that period passed in 1944, Congress also eliminated a requirement for proof of lawful entry into the United States before a non-citizen could apply for citizenship on the basis of their service. So in other words, at the time, Congress authorized those whom we would now call undocumented individuals to enlist and qualify for citizenship on the basis of their military service. Today, there had been in place more recently a somewhat similar analogous program. Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, generally speaking, only US citizens and green card holders can enlist in the US military. However, there's a provision of the act that permits the Secretary of Defense to authorize other non-citizens to enlist if their enlistment is vital to the national interest. And in 2008, pursuant to this provision, the Secretary of Defense authorized a program permitting non-green card holding foreign nationals to enlist if they were healthcare professionals or possessed foreign language skills with an associated cultural background critical to the military. So through this program, non-citizens who are, for example, here on a student or work visa, what we call non-immigrant visas, could also enlist in the military. And very importantly, so could so-called dreamers, individuals who came to the United States as children, but essentially lack immigration status in this country. And in fact, this program was pretty much the only pathway to citizenship for dreamers. One of our original plaintiffs in our lawsuit was actually a dreamer. And unfortunately, this program that I mentioned, accepting non-green card holders, stopped accepting new enlistees in around 2016. The program's essentially been shuttered to some degree. But there do remain a fair number of service members in the military today who are able to enlist through the program and who have continued to serve and been able to naturalize. So in short, periods of armed conflict have opened up to immigrants really a pathway to citizenship that might not have existed before. For most service members, that's meant a significantly expedited pathway. For others, it's also meant an opportunity to naturalize when they might not have been able to otherwise. And, from my perspective, I see that as obviously a huge benefit. And I don't say this to lionize conflict because it opens up these pathways, but just to point out that war has had this really interesting and significant impact on the history of immigration in this country.
Thank you. And yes, it's amazing how much immigrants have contributed. And yes, how it does in times of need. And this kind of gets back to what Dr. Stur was saying. In times of need, when you need people in the ranks, it's been easier for immigrants to go in, greater recruitment of women. I believe also minorities as well to an extent. So thank you. I'd like to follow that up with another question. And this can to follow up in terms of exactly what you've been seeing recently. How have the challenges, in terms of the era of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, the past 20 years, what have been sort of the unique challenges that immigrants have faced in the military in that time?
Well, I don't have the same kind of historical background that other panelists have. And so most of my work in this area is really focused on much more recent challenges, although I do have some theories as to why these challenges have emerged, particularly in the modern era. But we've seen very recently a number of really serious challenges to the path to expedited naturalization for immigrants serving in the military. I mean, I'll start by talking about our lawsuit with which I'm most familiar. That lawsuit challenged a 2017 policy, which effectively attempted to eradicate that path. As I mentioned, Congress has long guaranteed non-citizens serving in the military an extremely expedited path to citizenship during periods of armed conflict. We're currently in a period of armed conflict, so non-citizens are eligible under a congressional statute to apply for naturalization as soon as they begin their service. The legislative history makes clear that this was to ensure non-citizens could naturalize before they had to deploy, potentially to combat zones. The 2017 policy did a number of things, but most notably it instituted minimum period of service requirements for non-citizens before they could apply for citizenship, even in a period of armed conflict. And those periods were 6 months for active duty service members and 1 year for selected reservists. And it doesn't sound like long periods of time, I think, to a civilian or a layperson, but it effectively meant that non-citizens could no longer naturalize during their training. In previous periods of armed conflict, it was totally the norm for non-citizens to essentially become citizens by the time they graduated from basic training, because that was the most effective way of ensuring they were citizens by the time they would deploy. Once they deploy, they go to their duty stations, especially to foreign duty stations, their ability to naturalize is much, much harder. And the impact of the policy, which we saw on the ground, was that many service members were now waiting long periods of time, not just 6 months or a year, but longer than that to naturalize, especially because during that period they were deployed, and for some of those service members while serving abroad. In 2017, this is even more alarming. The Department of Defense also instituted another policy, which essentially put in place onerous new background checks before green card holders who enlisted could ship to basic training. And those background checks were so onerous that it essentially blocked green card holders from beginning their service in some cases for years, multiple years, 2 years, 3 years. And when the policy was instituted, it essentially put a 100% hold on the pipeline of green card holders shipping out to basic training and beginning their service. And the ACLU of Southern California, one of the ACLU affiliates, actually challenged this policy in court, got it temporarily enjoined or temporarily paused, and it was eventually abandoned by the government. And then finally, I mentioned there was the program to permit non-green card holders to enlist if they had specialized skills like medical expertise or certain linguistic or cultural competencies. And as I mentioned, that program was launched in 2008, but later halted. That means that if you're not a green card holder, you're a different type of non-citizen, you essentially can no longer enlist in the military. So in short, especially in recent years, we've seen a number of very, very serious challenges to the very idea that immigrants should even serve in our military, let alone earn their citizenship through their service, which contravenes the long history of immigrant service in the military in this country. We fought back some of these challenges, but I think really need to remain vigilant and in particular ensure that immigrants entitled to their naturalization are able to obtain it through their military service. And I'm not sure, there are, I think, near-term and longer-term reasons for these policies. I think it's very clear these policies came into place in 2017 during the Trump administration when there was effectively across the waterfront of pathways to citizenship and a real effort by that administration to try and throttle many different pathways to citizenship. And one of those pathways happens to be through military service. So that was identified and there was an attempt to essentially block that off. There might also be something, I'm not a military expert, but there might be something about the nature of the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan, much smaller number of folks in our country serving in those wars, potentially less more potential like public detachment or disillusionment with those conflicts that might also help the public somehow be less sympathetic to the idea that immigrants also serving in these conflicts are entitled to their citizenship. I'm not sure, but I could imagine during a period like World War I or World War II, where you saw like a much broader societal effort, contribution to those wars, perhaps a much warmer reception to the idea that you had not just citizens, but also immigrants to this country deciding, to sacrifice life and limb to go abroad and fight in these conflicts. Probably just higher public support for, contribution to those efforts, which might have also contributed to higher, I don't know at the time if there's any polling, but potentially more of an embrace of the idea that non-citizens serving in those conflicts should be entitled to their citizenship.
Thank you for that. I do know that, in terms of that last point, that there have been, with regards to how the Afghanistan war ended, has been an incredible push to get, non-military members, but people who help the military, interpreters, et cetera, in Afghanistan out. And that's something I've seen just here in Chicago. There are some organizations that are trying to do that. I just add that to show that there are people who definitely appreciated the sacrifices made by allies over there and trying to get them to the United States to safety. But thank you for those wonderful comments. Again, in terms of, I want to go to Dr. Jefferson and then Dr. Stur. Again, in terms of Dr. Jefferson, from the standpoint of minorities in the ranks, what have been, in recent years, what have been the greatest challenges to diversity that you've seen?
I think, I just want to say, Ms. Kim, the work that you're doing, looking at basically naturalization, immigration, and how it relates to military service, I think is really important because as you were talking, I was thinking about how the US Navy, particularly during the early 20th century, would openly recruit basically immigrants from the Pacific to serve in the Navy. At the same time, it was restricting the numbers of African-American personnel, messmen and stewards in particular, during that period. And we can look at those and see that there is this intersection of opportunity that is happening within each branch of the service. That's just something off the top of my head. But going back to your question and thinking about this, I think one of the greatest challenges that I think the contemporary military is facing is trying to create wider spaces for diversity dialogue among its service personnel. And I say that in light of both domestic, basically the domestic issues that have occurred over the last 5 years, and then also thinking about it in terms of the types of policy that have been enacted, particularly after 2017, right? And they're finding, I think, in the DoD, they're trying to figure out how to create these spaces. They have these talking points in which they're giving to service personnel and so forth. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges they face now. The other challenge, I think, is to try to educate the public about the historical encounters with race, gender, as well as sexual orientation, how that has played out historically. I mentioned the U.S. Navy, but also we have to think about it in terms of the lived history now. I mean, I look at the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and he, just recently during Black History Month, he talked about how he attended West Point. And one of his, he didn't know it at the time, but one of his mentors was basically Henry Flipper. Flipper was somebody who was, he was one of the early West Point graduates. And the thing about the way that Austin talked about him was Flipper was from his hometown of Thomasville, Georgia. And I think once we start to make those historical connections, we'll see that there's great strength in trying to develop basically these avenues of diversity within the contemporary military. And then also in light of the all volunteer force, we're seeing disproportionate numbers of African-American service personnel in the ranks. Like the last time I looked at the numbers, there were 21% of all active duty personnel were African-American. So they're trying to figure this out, and what does this all mean? I think that's one of the greatest challenges going forward, is to try to figure out, okay, what does this mean in terms of trying to create the most efficient and the most productive military force in order to face the dangers that we are facing now. And I really would like to hear the other panelists talk about that a little bit. What does that mean? But I think those are the three areas, the 2 or 3 areas where I think that the military now is facing its greatest challenge, trying to meet the domestic challenges, as well as seeing the international basically challenges that are unfolding now, and try to fit all of those, the vision for having a more diverse, a multi-people force in order to confront those challenges. I think that those are some of the greatest things that they face.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jefferson. And that's actually a nice segue to Dr. Stur. In terms of Dr. Stur, do you see what are the greatest challenges you see for women in the force, LGBTQ service members, and other things that Dr. Jefferson may have pointed out?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Jefferson's comments were dovetail really nice into mine. So a couple of things one thing, kind of one of the main things for women and LGBTQ personnel that they have to deal with, as far as the challenges that they face, the military faces in integrating them more fully, is culture. Because the armed services can make laws saying, okay, the Army's got to admit women, the Army's got to allow gay people to serve openly, or the Navy, whichever. I'm just using the Army as an example. Any of the branches of the services, legally you can't discriminate based on gender, based on sexual orientation. But that doesn't necessarily change the mindset of both the people that they're serving alongside and the American public, which I think in some ways still remains invested in this image of the American soldier as a heterosexual male, if not a white heterosexual male, projecting American power in the world. And while we all know that the U.S. military does lots of other things in the world, and power is projected through technology as much as it is through people in the current era, I think there is still that cultural image of the American soldier and that person who serves and protects the country as being male and heterosexual. And so that cultural change, you just can't legislate that. And so that's something that I think remains a challenge for the services as they try to integrate women and also LGBTQ personnel. And then another thing for women and to a certain degree for transgender personnel is the issue of the healthcare needs that are specific to those two groups of people. So for women, healthcare needs related to motherhood. So what do you do if you have, and especially now that women can serve in combat units, if a woman can serve in a combat unit and she becomes pregnant, what do we, how do we deal with that? I mean, obviously there will be a point in her service where she is no longer physically capable or no longer safe for her to serve in that kind of capacity. And so, how does the military prepare for that in terms of having other personnel that can come in for her while she's on maternity leave and those sorts of things? And in the case of transgender personnel too, there are particular healthcare needs that they require. So then there's this question and conversation as to what degree do the armed forces, if they're going to integrate transgender personnel, do they need to then also provide the medical care unique to that community? And so the kind of the cultural issue and then the healthcare issue are two things that I think provide the biggest challenges for women and LGBTQ personnel as the armed forces continue to integrate them more fully into the services.
Thank you, Dr. Stur. Scarlett Kim, did you want to add anything based upon what Dr. Jefferson and Dr. Stur were saying there?
Well, I actually wanted to respond to a point that Dr. Jefferson made, which I thought was really interesting and I haven't thought about, but there was something that occurred to me, which is that, I think it's true historically, but you see this reflected in the military, that you see lots of different opportunities amongst groups kind of I don't know how you say it, those pathways parlayed against each other. Mm-hmm. And one thing that's really interesting in this particular context is that non-citizens are denied many different opportunities in the military until they become citizens. For example, you can't be an officer. You cannot, even if you might be a linguistic specialist, it might require you, in order to really leverage that ability, to be in a role that requires access to intelligence. And you can't get the clearance to do that type of work until you become a citizen. So what's really interesting is this idea that you might have non-citizens come in to do the work historically, like the military might have identified non-citizens as a good pipeline into the military in some ways because they might not be clamoring in the same way for certain opportunities that historically have been denied, for example, to Black personnel, but who wanted to move up in the ranks. But then also because by virtue of their status, until they became citizens, non-citizens could not avail themselves of those opportunities, which in some ways might have been, maybe not explicit, but also makes it in some ways appealing as a sub part of the military that's easier to place in certain respects or control in certain respects. So I just thought that was really interesting. It's been one of the injuries that we noted in our complaint is that many of our clients and class members want to be able to follow certain career pathways in the military, whether it's to try and become an officer or whether it's to leverage their IT expertise or their linguistic expertise, and those pathways until they obtain their citizenship are denied to them. So it's been a really specific problem in this context. And another reason why obtaining citizenship so expeditiously is really important in both directions, not just important for the service member, but it's also very important for the military in order to fully integrate these folks and use the abilities for which they were recruited, effectively once they're in the military.
Thank you. And I like your last point there, that denying non-citizens' pathways into the military not just affects their own citizenship lives, but also has impact on national security in terms of the military not getting the people needs for its functions, which you see, not just immigrants, but writ large in terms of not being able to get certain people, not being able to get certain people to serve certain functions like computers and cyber and that type of thing, although they're trying to improve. And I also like the points that Dr. Jefferson and Dr. Stur made about that, especially Dr. Stur, that although society and the military informally recognize the value of diversity and different people and different types of people, serving the military, within the military, there does seem to be certain groups that don't quite appreciate the needs of diversity. And this is something that was driven home to me. Before I was working here at the Pritzker Museum, I was on the faculty of the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth. And it was very clear to me that, our force is incredibly diverse and only getting more so. And that officers need to be comfortable commanding units that are very diverse. And a lot of my students understood that, and a lot of my colleagues. But in talking to them, it was very clear to me that some of their colleagues outside the school who didn't go to SAMS maybe didn't necessarily understand that, or didn't make it the priority that it really needs to be if you're going to have a functioning, high morale military to serve the needs of the nation. So I just saw that just working in a military institution, and I found it fascinating and a little disturbing too. So thank you for bringing out those points, all of you. We have a few minutes left. I don't know if there anyone, yes, we do have a question from the live stream audience. Has the acceptance of the LGBTQ civilian employees in the DoD workforce affected the Pentagon's policies regarding LGBTQ service members, particularly trans employees and service members? And I'll just throw that to any one of our panelists who would like to address that.
Thank you for that question. I actually, I'm not sure policy-wise on that. I would suspect that there is, some overlap as far as as policy changes to incorporate more acceptance in one area, whether it's civilian world or the military world. The other one does seem to follow suit. I would think, just saying that kind of anecdotally, as far as the research I'm done, but I don't know if maybe Scarlett might be able to talk more specifically about the policy side of that.
I wish I could, but it's not an area that I've done any work in. I would mention that some of my colleagues at the ACLU are more familiar with this area. For example, we were involved in a lawsuit challenging the ban on trans service members. But I personally, I'm sorry, I can't speak to that.
Dr. Jefferson, do you have anything you'd like to add on this?
I just wonder also, to the question, and I wondered how much has the historical experience of the armed forces have been brought to bear on that particular question, because I think if you start to look at, the military in itself as being a microcosm of the larger society, then you start to think about, okay, what are the historical dimensions of this? And then also what can we look towards that's going to give us some idea as to how we might be able to approach this issue, and how can we basically as scholars and as students of history, how can we help our students as well as the general public try to understand the complexities of it?
I find that to be a fascinating point, and especially in terms of, when you think about the military, there's often not a lot of discussion of civilian employees in the DoD. It's always been service members, and there's very good reasons for that. But our current military is supported by many, many hundreds of thousands of civilians. And sometimes there are tensions between how do you serve the civilians, how do you serve the military service members, what is the interaction between the two? And this is another fascinating aspect of that. And how I wish I knew more about sort of service policy of the DoD towards trans service members. It's a fascinating question. So thank you, and thanks for posing the question. Are there any other questions from the live stream audience while we have a couple minutes?
You know, I just thinking about this question a little bit more.
Okay.
I know that some of the museums around the country are starting to really grapple with that. I mean, in terms of how do you educate the public about these issues and their complexities. And one of them in particular, the Intrepid Museum in New York, they're starting to get at that. They start to look at it, look at the historical dimensions of the issue in itself among naval personnel. So it's, I think there's a lot of room there to explore these topics and more. Let's put it that way.
Yes, in fact, I was just looking up or attempting to look up. I know that at the Pritzker Museum, there was a screening of a documentary about transgender soldiers about a year or two ago. So the Pritzker Museum has tried to raise some awareness on some of these issues as well. That's why we had the documentary. It's one of the reasons we had this panel. And next year, I can say that the organization plans to have many more programs about diversity in the military and the armed forces. So for most of that, that'll be one of our things for next year. So I think that the Pritzkers, we're trying to do our part along the lines that you just identified, Dr. Jefferson. So, so I would like to thank everyone for participating. So thanks to Scarlett Kim and Heather Stur and Robert Jefferson for a vibrant and fascinating discussion. And Ms. Kim, again, I'll echo Dr. Jefferson's sentiments earlier that thank you in the ACLU for what you're doing on behalf of trying to safeguard immigrants' rights in the military. And thank you, Dr. Stur and Jefferson, for your research on these issues. And thank you to everyone who logged in for our discussion this evening via live stream. The Pritzker Military Museum and Library is open to the public and is currently featuring our new exhibit, Life Behind the Wire, Prisoners of War, here in our downtown Chicago location. We have additional events that can be attended in person or via live stream, such as our programs on June 2nd, hosted in conjunction with the International Spy Museum. For information on these and other events, you can visit our website at pritzkermilitary.org. Thank you everyone again for joining us. Hope to see you all soon, either on live stream or at the museum, and have a great night. Take care.